In short, a lot. It costs a lot to own an E60 M5, but that's obvious. The sky is blue and the grass is green too. But in my new series, How Much, we're going to be discussing how much it costs to own these special cars. We'll start by contextualizing this car and talking about how it's used. Then we'll take a look at the 3 most expensive years of maintenance, and then we'll put it all together and talk about how much in totality it costs to own a special car, like this E60 M5. Before I get going, no, this E60 M5 is not currently for sale. It belongs to my friends at E39 Source. If you're unfamiliar, E39 Source is the place to have your special BMW serviced in Southern California. Whether it's an E60 M5, an E39 M5, or a Z8, E39 Source is the place to take it to. I will have all of their information in the description below. Go check them out, and a special thank you to Ryan and Gary. Right then, let's dive in. This is a 2006 E60 generation BMW M5 owned by my friend Gary. He bought this car in 2013 with approximately 18,000 miles and has gone on to add an additional 112,000 miles. The car's odometer now sits at roughly 130,000 miles. Not a common experience that people get to have with E60 M5s. It's pretty impressive. During his ownership with this car, he used it for a long time as a daily driver, but as the car became more special, he decided to retire it from daily use as he bought other cars to take up that purpose. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that this car has a manual transmission. For the true BMW nerds, you also know that in 2006, you couldn't get an E60 M5 with a manual transmission. Of course, you could get the car in the North American market with a 6-speed, but not in 2006. This car has been manually converted by E39 Source. And this is something that I will go into a little bit more detail with later in the video. In addition to that, this car has lived quite a life. It was involved in a relatively serious accident, but then it was repaired perfectly. The second binder that's included with this car documents the entire journey of restoring it basically back to perfection. Ryan and his dad are really picky about their cars, and it shows with not only how nice this one is, as it's one of the nicest E60s I've ever seen, but also how well documented it is, and it makes for an interesting case for this How Much series. In addition to really impressive service binders, this car also has an incredible spreadsheet documenting every service during Gary's ownership. And we're going to start by talking about the most expensive years of ownership, starting with 2017. Now, in 2017, this car began the year with some cosmetic stuff. The rear bumper needed to be repainted. I remember it had gotten tapped a couple of times in parking lots, and I think it also got tapped on the highway during a rainy situation, something like that. Not super damaged or anything, but ultimately Ryan and Gary decided to replace the entire bumper. The paintwork on that cost $571. The bumper carrier itself, $381, and the deformation element, which is just a little pad that's in there, costs $119. They also replaced very little things like the power steering reservoir cap gasket, which cost $32.21, and little things like that. But then the things become a little bit more advanced. They decided to replace the spark plugs, and they did the labor on that themselves, but that cost $121.90. And then it needed front tires. This car got Michelin Pilot Super Sport at the time. That was the best available tire for $736.15. Naturally, the tires also were balanced and an alignment was performed then, so just kind of the routine maintenance stuff that you would do with a car like this. Then this car needed something slightly larger. The oil cooler was determined to be leaking and needed to be replaced. Now, this is before E39 Source was a shop, so Gary took this to a different independent to have that performed, and that in total with parts and labor came to $1,600 even. While the car was there, it also got an oil change, hardly a surprise, but yep, that's one of those things that just seems to pop up with E60s. $1,600 service here, $1,600 service there. In addition to some other minor items, one of the big things that happened in 2017 was replacement of the headlights. Again, if you're very eagle-eyed, you'll realize that this car has facelift front and rear lights. At the time, the car had about 80,000 miles, and I believe wear was the reason for this. The lenses had become all pitted and were looking very bad, and the new lights were available at the time. So Ryan and Gary decided to replace them altogether, and that was pretty extensive. In addition to replacing the headlight assemblies themselves, they also had to replace a lot of wiring, and they had to figure out how to get things to work. It meant that they had to reprogram the light module and do a lot of work to get everything to be just perfect. I believe there's a video on E39 source about this entire process that walks you through it, and well, as you would expect, it's incredibly thorough. That whole process wasn't expensive though. Just in parts, it cost them $4,117.06 to update the lighting on this car. But of course, it meant they also got content out of it, and they learned the process themselves, which would come in handy when they start a BMW independent shop later on. Closing in on the end of the year, it's kind of interesting. This car then needed rear tires, so instead of getting Super Sports, they were no longer available. It got Michelin Pilot Sport 4S rear tires at a cost of $646.86 for 2 of those. Again, of course, those were mounted in mounts, and another alignment was performed. And that wraps up the year, bringing the total for 2017 to $8,784.65. But in the words of Al Pacino from Son of a Woman, I'm just getting warmed up. And we move to 2019, the second most expensive year of ownership for this M5. We start the year with some suspension components. This car would have its front wishbones replaced and all of the associated hardware as well. It also had the stabilizer links replaced, and then it also got the pre-cat oxygen sensor and the post-cat oxygen sensors replaced. These services were completed by Ryan and Gare, and we only really have to concern ourselves with parts costs for those, but it came to $767.80. Honestly, that's quite a bit less than I was expecting for how major those components are, so not really all that bad in the end. Then at the end of the month in January, this car needed a couple more things. The alternator started to go out on this car, so that needed to be replaced. And naturally, that also means doing the associated hardware with that, the belt, things like that, the AC belt while you're in there, do that as well, as with any BMW. And they decided to refinish all 4 wheels. At this point, we're at 100,000 miles. So again, it's just in order to keep the car looking fresh. The total for that service came to $1,671.40. Then the car needed tires again, front and rear, this time with matching Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tires, $563.98 for the front and $669.98 for the rear. As you would expect, they were mounted and balanced, and an alignment was performed at that time as well. To close out January, the car also then needed a brake service, and they decided to go with Hawk HPS brake pads for this car. And as you would expect, everything got replaced. Rotor set screws, brake pad wear sensors, retaining clips and springs, all of that. And they did the labor themselves. The total came to $1,232 just in parts, but kind of normal consumptional stuff with this car. And the Hawk pads are pretty good, so I'm not surprised that they went with that upgrade, but that's what it came to close out January. Some other miscellaneous items would be replaced within there, but then came the biggest service of the year in 2019 when the clutch had to be replaced on this car. Now at the time, it still had its SMG transmission, so it kind of is a bummer that they replaced the clutch and then a year later would do the manual conversion, but nonetheless, it had to be replaced, and that total service came to $2,700. This was done by another shop here in San Diego. I guess they didn't have time, and E39 source wasn't yet a fully established shop, so had to be done elsewhere. But yeah, $2,700. Actually not as bad as I was expecting, given that everything had to be replaced, and the driveline would get refreshed too. The center support bearing, the flex disc, stuff like that would also get replaced on the drive shaft. And the year then wraps up with a service to the engine, replacement of the spark plugs and coils. This total service came to $830.81. You got to remember, there are 10 of each, which is a lot, and so they all had to be replaced, and well, it was a relatively minor service in the end, but still $830 in parts. Over the course of 2019, approximately 13,000 miles would be added to this thing, meaning it was being used and enjoyed regularly. But that brings us to the total. 2019 comes to $10,520.79. Now, of course, there are some pretty large items that happened to fall in that year, so kind of makes sense, but nonetheless, that is a whopper. Before we get on to the most expensive year of service with this car has had everything documented all the way back to the beginning, and some very common issues that are known on the E60 M5 certainly crept up on its past, and I wanted to highlight those because, well, we have the data. In 2018, this car needed to have its rod bearings replaced. This was done preventatively. Every oil change and analysis was done to see how worn they were, and ultimately the owner decided it was time to replace them, and so they were done. But it wasn't just those that were replaced. In addition to the bearings, the Vanos high pressure oil line was replaced, and a bunch of other associated hardware too, including the oil pump guide rail, an oil change, the brake fluid was done, the deflection pulley for the water pump and alternator, all of that stuff was replaced. And the total for this service back in 2018 came to $3,262.40. Honestly, that doesn't seem that bad given how invasive this service was. And that kind of dispels one of the myths of rod bearings. Yes, it's an expensive service to do, but the key to it is doing it preventatively. When you don't do that, ultimately you could lose the engine, and that's what I call an expensive service. So if you get ahead of it like this owner did, it can cost you a lot less, and it's really not that bad. Granted, this was 8 years ago. Labor costs and parts prices have gone up since, but nonetheless, I think this dispels the myth. It's not that crazy expensive to have the rod bearings replaced on this car, but you absolutely need to do so in order to ensure S85's health. Another major thing this car is known for is issues with the throttle actuators, and this car has had them replaced on 2 separate occasions, once in June 2016 and again in 2020. The first time they were done at the dealer, and in addition to replacing the actuators, the thermostat, O-rings, hose clamps, various associated hardware, coolant, all of that stuff was replaced too. The total for that service back in 2016 came to $5,286.27. But E39 Source also did that same service again later in 2020, many miles later, and that service came to, just in parts, $3,013.89. I would imagine it's even more considering it's 6 years after that, and you have to factor in labor costs as those vary across the country, but that's how much it costs to remedy them twice on this particular E60 M5. And that brings us to 2022, the most expensive year in this car's past. Now that year was really big because this car got its restoration, which I'll go into here in a minute, but I'm not factoring in most of the cost of that as it was the result of an accident and some of the stuff you didn't really need to do. But looking at the service records, there's certainly some good items in there that, ultimately make a lot of sense to replace. This car also had about 127,000 miles on it at the time, so it's just stuff that you tend to run into, from simple things like air filters to gaskets, and then of course stuff that you find on the front of the engine, stuff like the radiator that just needs to be replaced at that mileage. All of this stuff had to be replaced, and there are hundreds of entries in the spreadsheet, so I kind of pulled them out and tabulated everything, but I'm not going to go through them individually. But just for perspective, the radiator cost $486.71. The wishbones on this car were replaced then as well. $143 for the left one, $142 for the right one. I love that there's that little discrepancy. And then after this car's major service, just had normal stuff that came up. One of those things that was optional though is this car got PPF on the front of this car and ceramic coating on the rest. After they finished the restoration project of this car, they wanted to make sure that it continued to look nice. So of course that makes sense. The differential oil was also replaced, something relatively basic, and the mirror glass on this car was replaced as it was starting to delaminate. But even so, after I pulled everything out to calculate this year, minus the stuff that was specifically related to the accident, it came to $15,856.97. That is just an astronomical amount of money. But let's talk a little bit more about the accident and then also the manual conversion that was done to this car in 2020. Now, when I say everything was replaced during the accident, I genuinely mean everything. This car got hit by another driver that came across the front of this car and caused a lot of damage. And so that meant that a lot of cosmetic things had to be replaced, stuff like the hood, the fenders, things like that. And then of course it also had to be repainted. While all of that stuff was disassembled, Ryan and his dad decided to replace truly everything on this car. They also just did a lot of servicing to it, and they replaced everything. I mean, here is a spacer with part number ending 2450, cost $11.36, down to stuff that cost $3 for a rivet. Like, I mean, just, it's exceptional the level of detail this goes into. But nonetheless, it was really expensive. The total for the accident and all of the repairs came to $45,716. A lot of money to set this car back to absolutely perfect condition. But that is kind of an unfortunate thing. Again, that's something you're probably not going to run into in your ownership with this car. But one thing you might be interested in considering is the manual conversion on this car. Now, this was the very first one that E39 Source had done, and they are the experts in the country now to do manual conversions on S85 powered cars. And at the time, really all they were paying for was parts. It was Ryan's own time and labor and expertise that went into figuring out how it was done. So it was really just focused on parts. And the total part cost at the time to do this manual conversion. That includes the clutch, the transmission, all the related lines, all the related coding that had to be done to this car that Ryan couldn't do himself. That came to $6,011.95. Now, I've looked into the cost of some of these components today and talked to Ryan, as this conversion was done in 2020. And to do the same conversion, he tells me that parts cost alone is almost 3 times more expensive. So if you contact the E39 source and you want to do a manual conversion to your E60, it's not going to be that inexpensive. It costs a lot more to do that these days, but at the time, as an experimental procedure, parts alone cost about $6,000 to do that. And that brings us to the final numbers. How much does it cost to own an E60 M5? Now, the cost per mile I also calculated for this car, but that's something that's you really should note. This car was driven 111,000 miles by one owner. That is amazing. Not many E60 M5s get to do that. Not many owners take on that challenge, and it's a pretty monumental figure. But over the time, not factoring in the cost of the accident or the manual conversion, the total cost comes to, not counting purchase price either, $57,213.76, meaning that this car realistically costs about 52 cents a mile to own just in maintenance. That's not accounting for gasoline consumption, and this thing drinks like an alcoholic, and it's not accounting for things like insurances. That kind of varies person to person. So huge figure to do that. But the total cost for this specific car, with everything factored in, $103,838.01, bringing the total cost per mile to 93 cents a mile. Certainly not great, but you have to keep in mind this car is perfect. And when I say perfect, I mean I genuinely, as picky as I am, cannot find flaws with it. It is as good an E60 M5 as any on the road. And well, ultimately, let's hop behind the wheel and go for a drive and see what 93 cents a mile feels like. Time to drive the E60 M5. I love this car. And in full honesty, despite how much I love my E39, I think the E60 M5 with a manual is a better car. Full stop. I think that it has a more interesting engine, a substantially more agile chassis. The build quality is better. It's a better car. But the thing that scares me, like it does everybody, is how much this thing costs to own. The engine was never designed to be in a 5 Series. So it means that, like, in order to service any aspect of it, it's quite intensive. You have to remove a lot. As these cars have aged and the components have become more expensive, that certainly is reflected in the ultimate cost to take care of these things. And yes, they have their foibles. There are sacrifices you have to make if you want to own this car. But ultimately, if you love the E60 M5 and the V10 BMWs, I can see someone making the argument that they feel okay spending the kind of money it takes to own one of these cars. It's a lot of money. It's as much as an exotic, but it is a really exotic car. So I get it. But that said, you have a V10 in there. Breaking it down a little bit more, of course, in addition to the engine, what also became really good, the steering got much better than the E39. The steering in the E39 is one of my biggest complaints about the car. The chassis got better. The suspension became much more sophisticated with EDC, electronic damper control. And in the end, it was just the evolution of the M5. But the E60 BMW really took a chance by giving it a 10-cylinder engine. You just feel like they did it because they could. If you need proof that the Germans have a sense of humor, I think the E60 M5 is one of those cars. They took their most sedate or austere car and, like, we put 10 cylinders in that one. I mean, really think about it. If you want a manual transmission in a 10-cylinder car, Gallardo, R8, Dodge Viper, like, those are the vehicles that come to mind. None of those cars have 4 doors. None of those cars really none of those cars can be used pretty much every day or designed to be used every day. It's just special. This car is a unique blend, and that means it's expensive to take care of. What I'm hoping to do with this series is get a number of cars together to understand, like, what the different ownership perspectives look like. In the case of this one, this was Ryan and his dad loved this car. They just loved this one. and wanted to take as great of care of it as possible. They wanted the car to be absolutely perfect so that you could put the key in, press the engine start button, and go anywhere in the country and drive and enjoy it. Now, their level of perfectionism might not be yours, but if you want to know, like, truly, you know, blank check, what does it cost to own one of these and keep it perfect? Now you know. It's just a fortune, but like I said, it's a very special car. I certainly understand. And just look at this car. It's just a beautiful representation of what the M5 should be. And I think this car really speaks to Ryan and Gary, not just who they are, but also how they run their business. This car is nut and bolt perfect. I can't find anything wrong with it. And you know how picky I am. That is why you go to E39 Source. You take a car to them because you want them to perfect it and restore it. And they are the best in the business when it comes to these sort of cars. This generation, the E60, the E39, like that is what they absolutely crush. Oh. What an experience. I've just forgotten how incredible this engine is. That it's so nice to drive one that just feels slick and tight and together. I think dang near perfect. Not inexpensive, but if you get it, if you understand the allure of a car like this, I can get behind spending that kind of money. Personally, for me, I chose the E39 just because it is a little bit easier to own, but the E60 is, you know, it's so good. Unfortunately, I'm not on that many twisty roads. I consider this to be like the M3 of M5s. High-strung, high-revving engine, very good chassis, communicative, agile. It's definitely, I think it's, for me, it's the second best M5. But there's a very good argument to be made that it is the first. And it's beyond the engine. It's the way everything comes together in this car. But admittedly, the engine does dominate the experience. It's just plain special. And that is how much it costs to own an E60 M5. Not inexpensive, but then again, this car is special. Naturally aspirated V10 up front, manual transmission in the middle, rear wheel drive, 4 doors, an awesome chassis. There's just no car like it. Not cheap, but very, very cool. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you very soon. Goodbye.